Immigrants have been migrating to the shores of the United States for centuries. Remember the Mayflower? With that in mind, it appears that historically, immigration is okay, as long as you're white. In 1848, gold was discovered in California, which started the gold rush, and many people flocked out west, including Chinese immigrants looking for a better life. Some also worked on farms, in the textile industry, and for the Central Pacific and transcontinental railroads, which accelerated westward expansion and helped with moving soldiers during the Civil War. Chinese people were not the only immigrants on American soil. The potato famine forced thousands of Irish people to leave Ireland, and by the 1840s, half of the immigrant population in the U.S. were Irish. There were also more than 5 million Germans in America at this time, but guess who were the targets of one of the first pieces of federal legislation restricting immigration? Take a wild guess. Enter the Page Act of 1875, which, in a nutshell, prohibited the entry of Chinese women into the United States. The first Chinese immigrants to come to the U.S. were for the most part male, and from jump there were problems afoot. Chinese men were willing to work for less pay, making them a threat to white workers. Eventually, more and more women made their way to the U.S. to accompany their husbands, or to also seek individual opportunities. Anti-Chinese narratives centered around portraying Chinese people as dirty and even diseased, and Chinese women faced the brunt of that narrative. They were stereotyped as promiscuous. The Page Act's purpose was to prohibit immigrants who were labeled undesirable from entering the United States, like convicts, forced laborers, and sex workers. Yes, some Chinese women who migrated to the U.S. did work in the sex industry, but so did their white immigrant counterparts. Also, who gives a fuck? But that's a conversation for another day. However, Chinese women were singled out, and racists felt the need to put a stop to these scandalous women coming to the U.S. and seducing God-fearing American men. Like I did that, that's what politicians do. Don't you do that. Once the Page Act was passed, David H. Bailey, the American consul in Hong Kong, was tasked with determining which Chinese women were acceptable for the United States. If a woman wanted to immigrate to America, she had to submit a declaration of purpose, a personal morality statement, an application for clearance, and a fee to the American consul. In addition, they were asked some amazing questions like, are you a virtuous woman? Do you intend to live a virtuous life in the U.S.? Do you go to the USA for the purposes of prostitution? Women had to prove that they grew up in respectable families and that their husbands could afford to support them in the U.S. They had to endure such invasive questioning and physical examinations, leaving their homes and when they got to the United States, that many women just said, fuck it, I ain't going. The Page Act was successful in reducing the number of Chinese sex workers in the United States, but it was also successful in virtually stopping Chinese women in general from entering the U.S. altogether. As a result, Chinese immigrants were unable to start families and lay down roots because, as we know, there were laws prohibiting people from marrying outside of their race. Which leads me to believe that this was also a way to say, we just don't want your culture here. And we damn sure don't want you having babies here and then becoming citizens. And a few years later, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed, which prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers, men, into the United States. That means an entire group of people were prohibited from entering the United States. Over the past year, irresponsible and racist public officials have used disgusting rhetoric targeting Asian people. That rhetoric has led to an uptick in violence towards the Asian community. Elderly people are being punched in the face, people are being attacked on the street, and women are being gunned down in their place of work. America has a long history of racism, and the targeting of Asian people is nowhere near new on American soil, and it is despicable and unacceptable. So let's stand up and fight for the Asian community during this time and for all time. Class dismissed.